Welcome to Mystery Archives. There is a certain kind of peace that comes with absolute isolation. To live far away from the noise of the city, surrounded only by the quiet breathing of the natural world, is a dream for many. But true isolation means that when the silence is finally broken, there is no one around to hear it. Tonight, we will explore the terrifying reality of what happens when the empty spaces around us are claimed by something we cannot see. So, turn off the lights, settle into the dark, and let the quiet mysteries of the night wash over you. Our first story begins deep within a dense, unforgiving forest. The man who lived there sought out the solitude on purpose. His home was a small, quiet sanctuary surrounded by towering pines. The only sounds that ever interrupted his days were the soft rustling of dry leaves, the distant calls of wildlife, and the steady, endless rushing of a shallow creek that cut through the ravine in his backyard. But as the months passed, the creek began to bring him things. It started with small, strange anomalies. He would find unusual rocks sitting on the muddy banks, stones with colors and textures that had absolutely no business existing in that part of the world. Then, the objects became more personal. A single, waterlogged shoe, an old, forgotten toy, books with their pages completely soaked and permanently fused together. It was as if someone, or something, was deliberately placing these items upstream, letting the slow current carry them down directly to his property. Then, the strangeness crept out of the water and into his home. Small, mundane items began to vanish from his house without any logical explanation. Deodorant, socks, little things he thought he had simply misplaced. But the heavy, suffocating feeling of being watched began to settle over the property. One crisp evening, he went looking for his heavy firewood axe. He searched the shed, the porch, and the yard, convinced he had left it outside. He lived entirely alone. There was not another human being for miles. But when he finally walked back into his bedroom, his breath caught in his throat. The heavy, sharp iron axe was resting perfectly on the wooden headboard of his bed. It was placed there deliberately, mockingly. A silent, terrifying message left right above the place where he slept. Desperate to escape the creeping dread of the forest, he packed his bags. He left the woods behind and signed a lease for a small, single-occupancy apartment on the 4th floor of a building in the heart of the city. He thought the concrete, the noise, and the sheer number of people surrounding him would finally bring him peace. Because he worked the night shift, his days were spent sleeping in the quiet apartment. But he soon realized that you cannot outrun something that doesn't leave footprints. It happened every single day, exactly at 4 p.m. He would be lying in bed, the apartment dead silent, and then a soft, metallic click would echo from the kitchen. It was the latch of the kitchen window unhooking itself. Slide. The glass pane would slowly glide open along its tracks. The faint breeze would catch the hanging wind chime, producing a soft, eerie melody that floated through the empty apartment. He would lie, frozen under his blankets, his heart hammering against his ribs. There were no footsteps, there were no shadows, but he could feel the heavy, oppressive weight of an entity slowly walking through his living room. A few agonizing moments later, the heavy brass doorknob of his front door would slowly, deliberately turn. The door would unlatch, leading out to the 4th floor hallway, as if whatever had climbed through his window had simply finished its daily patrol and let itself out. He never got out of bed to check. He never dared to look. He endured that psychological torture for 3 agonizing, sleepless months. Finally, his spirit broken, he packed his bags and moved back to his isolated home in the deep forest. He realized that if he was going to be hunted by something unseen, He preferred to face it in the familiar shadows of the woods rather than in a concrete box in the sky. Some entities will follow you across the world, refusing to let you go. But other unseen presences prefer to wait patiently in the dark corners of your own home, biding their time until the ones you love finally walk out the front door. Let us travel now to a quiet suburban neighborhood where a husband is about to leave for his night shift, and his wife is about to hear a sigh that belongs to no one. The house was perfectly ordinary. It was a modest 30-year-old build, sitting quietly on a typical suburban street. It wasn't remarkably old, and it carried no tragic history. It was exactly the kind of place where you would expect to feel completely safe. The wife living there was the most grounded, rational person you could ever meet. If a floorboard creaked in the night, she blamed the plumbing. If a door swung shut, she blamed a draft. She was completely oblivious to the paranormal. But after 3 years of living in that quiet house, her logic finally shattered. One evening, she sat her husband down. Her hands were trembling violently in her lap, and tears were silently streaming down her face. She confessed that she had been carrying a terrifying secret almost since the day they moved in. It started subtly in the attic. In the dead of night, she would hear the unmistakable sound of a heavy, dead weight being slowly dragged across the wooden beams directly above their ceiling. Over the months, the sounds grew bolder. They moved out of the attic and onto the stairs. She would be sitting alone in the dim light of the living room, and she would hear them. Thump, thump, thump. 2 or 3 hard, deliberate footsteps descending the carpeted stairs. It sounded exactly as if someone invisible was trying to announce their presence, demanding to be noticed. But the most chilling detail wasn't the footsteps. It was the sigh. Several times, while standing alone in the kitchen or sitting quietly on the couch, the suffocating silence of the room would be broken by a loud, heavy exhale. It was a deep, guttural sigh, sounding exactly like a large man collapsing into a chair after a long, exhausting day. And the sound always originated from the empty air just a few feet behind her shoulder. There was a terrifying pattern to the haunting. The entity only ever made a sound when her husband was completely unconscious or when he was out of the house. It waited in the dark, studying their routines, choosing to manifest only when she was entirely alone and utterly vulnerable. The husband listened in stunned silence. Suddenly, a chilling realization washed over him. For years, he had suffered from a recurring nightmare. Every few months, he would dream of a dark, crushing energy chasing him down. The invisible weight would paralyze him, completely sealing his lips so he couldn't call out for help or recite a prayer. He realized then that the dark energy wasn't just a dream. It was deliberately keeping him trapped in a deep, paralyzed sleep, ensuring he couldn't wake up to protect his wife. The climax of their terror happened a few nights later. The husband had to work a late shift, leaving his wife alone until 2 a.m. She was curled up on the couch, the television muted, her back facing the long, dark hallway that led to the front door. The house settled into a heavy, breathless quiet. And then, from the pitch-black corridor behind her, a sound began. It wasn't a footstep. It was a low, rhythmic, guttural moaning, a deep, raspy grunting that echoed slowly from the dark. It went on for agonizing minutes. The air in the living room turned freezing cold. She sat completely paralyzed. She didn't pause the TV, she didn't reach for her phone, and she absolutely refused to turn around. Every instinct in her body screamed that if she looked into that dark hallway, she would be giving the entity exactly the attention it was desperately craving. She sat in the dark, tears silently running down her cheeks, enduring the terrifying, guttural sounds, until the house finally fell silent once more. The most terrifying monsters aren't the ones that hide in the woods. They are the ones that learn your schedule, quietly waiting in your hallway for you to be truly, entirely alone. But while some entities hide in the open spaces of a modern home, others claim the forgotten, shadowy corners of ancient estates. Let us travel across the ocean to the English countryside, where a patch of darkness in a long corridor simply refuses to let the light in. The English countryside is known for its sprawling, idyllic landscapes. But nestled within those rolling hills are ancient houses, structures that have stood for centuries, soaking in the memories of generations. Our third story takes us to one of these massive, damp, and impossibly quiet homes. It was a family estate. During the holidays, the house would be filled with the loud, comforting hum of a reunion. But beneath the laughter, there was a heavy, unspoken rule among the children. You never, ever wandered the halls alone at night. And if you had to walk down the long, dim corridors, you never looked too closely into the open doorways. There was one specific hallway that connected the front of the house to the kitchen. It was narrow, smelling faintly of ancient wood and damp stone. In the exact center of that hallway was a heavy patch of shadow. No matter how bright the sun shone outside, no matter how many lamps were lit, that specific patch of floor remained swallowed in a thick, unnatural darkness. The children called it the dead spot. Whenever they had to pass it, they kept their eyes locked straight ahead, terrified that if they turned their heads, something would be standing in the dark, watching them back. It wasn't until decades later that the truth of the dead spot was revealed. The father of the family confessed that he had once built a small, enclosed bathroom in that exact spot for the grandparents, but the door was kept permanently locked. It was never used. The grandparents refused to step foot inside, quietly claiming that something else already lived in that space. 18 years passed. The family moved away, leaving the massive house mostly empty, save for one uncle who stayed behind to care for the aging grandmother. When the father finally returned to help restore the crumbling estate, the house was waiting for him. One night, the heavy silence of the room woke him at 3 a.m. He slowly opened his eyes in the pitch black. Sitting perfectly still on the edge of his antique dresser was a dark, human-shaped figure. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just sat in the freezing dark, staring at him as he lay paralyzed in bed. When he quietly mentioned it to the uncle the next morning, the uncle didn't even flinch. He simply nodded, his eyes tired and hollow. The uncle confessed that he had spent years living with the unseen occupants. He had watched a pale little girl with long dark hair run silently down the upstairs hallway, only to vanish straight into a solid brick wall where the old front door used to be. He had seen a massive, distorted face hovering in the empty living room, looking as if it were pressing itself through the very fabric of the air. The true terror of the house, however, was felt in the attic. During their visit, the narrator of our story decided to inspect the upstairs renovations. They climbed the old, creaking wooden ladder, surrounded by the suffocating smell of dust and dry rot. They slowly pushed the heavy wooden hatch open and poked their head into the cavernous, pitch-black space of the attic. They didn't see a ghost. They didn't hear a scream. But the moment their head breached the darkness, their entire body froze. A wave of profound, freezing dread washed over them. The air grew impossibly heavy. They could feel it with absolute, undeniable certainty. Something was crouched in the dark, right behind their head. It was hovering just inches away, radiating a pure, predatory anger. Every single survival instinct in their body screamed a single command: do not turn around. They couldn't breathe. They couldn't blink. They slowly, agonizingly lowered themselves back down the ladder, their hands trembling violently against the wooden rungs, retreating from the darkness without ever looking back. Some houses are simply too old, holding on to their dark secrets in the empty rooms. They know exactly when you are separated from the group. They know when you are alone. And that is when they choose to reveal themselves. But while some spirits claim entire estates, others attach themselves to a single person, following them into the most disciplined and secure environments imaginable. Let us travel now to Australia, where a young police recruit is about to learn that his new badge offers absolutely no protection against the dead. Our fourth story takes us to the quiet, humid suburbs of Brisbane. A young man named Wayne, a hardened military veteran turned police recruit, needed a cheap place to stay during his academy training. He rented a spare room in a classic Queenslander, an old semi-elevated timber house with long, creaking hallways and deep, heavy shadows. Wayne was a staunch skeptic. He was a man of logic, firearms, and strict discipline. He did not believe in ghosts. But almost immediately after moving in, the oppressive atmosphere of the house began to chip away at his resolve. The owner of the house had a small dog, but the animal never barked. It never ran around the yard. Instead, it spent every waking moment pressed into the darkest, furthest corner underneath the bed, shivering uncontrollably. It was terrified of something the living couldn't quite see. Soon, Wayne began to feel it too. Whenever he was completely alone in the house, the air would grow unnaturally thick. He would catch fleeting, impossible glimpses of an elderly woman floating silently down the wooden hallway, her feet suspended just inches above the floorboards. She never spoke. She simply wandered the house, observing the new occupants with a cold, hollow gaze. But the true horror did not happen to Wayne. It happened to his father-in-law, who came to visit just days before Wayne's graduation. The older man was given the spare room at the end of the hall. The first night was suffocatingly hot and dead silent. Around 3 a.m., the father-in-law was pulled from a deep sleep. It wasn't a loud noise that woke him. It was a sudden, freezing drop in temperature that seemed to settle directly over his chest. He opened his eyes in the pitch black. He was completely paralyzed. His mind raced, but his muscles refused to obey. And then he felt a physical touch. It was not a violent grab. It was a slow, agonizingly gentle caress. The freezing, translucent back of a hand slowly brushed against his cheek. He lay there, trapped in his own body, feeling the icy, undeniable sensation of dead fingers slowly tracing his skin in the dark. Hovering right above his face, leaning over him in the silence, was the phantom of the old woman. He couldn't scream. He couldn't close his eyes. He was forced to endure the terrifying, intimate touch of the dead until the sun finally began to rise. The next morning, Wayne's perfectly polished police cap band, a vital piece of his uniform, vanished from the top of a high wardrobe, never to be seen again. The message was clear. They were not welcome. The two grown men, both hardened and deeply rational, packed their bags and fled the house that very day, utterly broken by the quiet power of the unseen. Wayne, the staunch atheist, walked out of that house a deeply changed man, knowing with absolute certainty that something waits for us in the dark. When a spirit makes physical contact, the boundary between the living and the dead is permanently shattered. But sometimes the dead don't want to touch you. They just want to be seen. Let us travel now to a freezing, empty room in Williamsburg, where a camera flash is about to capture a deeply disturbing secret. Our fifth story takes us to an old historic house in Williamsburg. It was a beautiful property, recently purchased by a mother hoping for a fresh start. But almost immediately after moving in, the house began to reject her presence. In the dead of night, when the house was completely silent, she would hear the faint, echoing laughter of an unseen child drifting down from the dark attic. Trying to rationalize the sounds, she once tossed a light, inflatable beach ball up the narrow wooden stairs into the pitch-black space. She stood at the bottom, holding her breath. A few agonizing seconds later, the ball was deliberately kicked back down. It bounced slowly down the wooden steps, rolling to a dead stop right at her feet. The angle of the stairs made it physically impossible for the ball to roll back on its own. Something in the dark had pushed it. But the attic wasn't the most terrifying part of the house. That title belonged to a small, completely empty room on the second floor. The room was entirely stripped of furniture. No bed, no chairs, no light fixtures. The only object inside was a single, tarnished antique mirror resting heavily against the far wall. Walking into that room felt like stepping into a meat locker. No matter how hot the summer was outside, the air inside that specific room was always 10 to 20 degrees colder, thick with an unnatural, bone-chilling frost. Curious and terrified, two young friends decided to step into the room to investigate. They brought an old digital camera with them. They closed the heavy door, plunging themselves into absolute, impenetrable darkness. For 40 minutes, they stood in that freezing, empty space. They didn't speak. They didn't turn on a flashlight. They simply pointed the camera into the black void and pressed the shutter, letting the soft, mechanical click echo in the quiet room. They felt nothing grab them. They heard no whispers. Eventually, the freezing cold became too much to bear, and they left the room, thinking the space was simply empty. But the next morning, when they turned the camera on to review the dark images, their blood ran completely cold. The very first picture on the screen was not empty. Sitting in the exact center of that pitch-black room, right in front of the antique mirror, was a massive, blurry, shadowy figure. It was crouching heavily on the floorboards. Surrounding its dark silhouette were tiny, floating, glowing spots, flickering like small, ghostly candles in the dark. As they stared closer at the small digital screen, the distorted features of the shadow began to look less human and more like the malformed, aggressive face of a demonic hound. The true horror didn't come from the image itself. It came from the paralyzing realization that they had been standing in the dark, completely blind, locked in a freezing room with a demonic entity for nearly an hour. A photograph can freeze a terrifying reality, proving that the shadows in our homes are never truly empty. But while some entities hide behind the glass of a lens or a mirror, others reveal themselves to us long before we ever step foot in their domain. Let us travel now to an apartment complex in South Korea, where a childhood dream is about to become a devastating reality. In a sprawling city, massive apartment buildings often stand like towering concrete monoliths, filled with hundreds of identical doors and endlessly repeating hallways. To a child, these structures can feel like a labyrinth, but for a 10-year-old girl living in apartment 304, the true maze of these buildings existed in a nightmare that would quietly dismantle her life. It began on what felt like a perfectly normal night. In her dream, the sun shone brightly over the concrete courtyard of her complex. She was playing outside, the rhythmic sound of a jump rope echoing in the warm air. But then, the ambient noise of the city completely vanished, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. The warm summer air turned unnaturally cold. A pale man in his mid-20s drifted slowly into the courtyard. His expression was completely blank, his footsteps perfectly silent against the pavement. When he stopped in front of the young girl, a wave of primal dread washed over her skin. He leaned in and in a quiet, hollow voice asked exactly where her mother was. Every survival instinct in the child's body screamed that this man was dangerous. Trembling in the cold air, she lied. She pointed toward a distant hill, claiming her mother was visiting a local shaman. The man drifted silently away. From a distance, the girl watched him approach the home. Suddenly, an older woman, perhaps the shaman, or perhaps an ancient protective ancestor, appeared in the doorway. The woman aggressively scolded the pale man, furiously banishing him into the dark for daring to seek out the child's mother. But the man realized he had been tricked. Instantly, the bright sun in the sky was extinguished. It didn't set, it simply vanished, plunging the world into a pitch-black, impenetrable night. Panic seized the girl's chest. She sprinted toward the safety of her apartment building. But when she pushed through the heavy lobby doors, the ground floor was no longer empty. It was filled with pale, translucent phantoms gliding across the linoleum floor in absolute, terrifying silence. Swallowing her terror, she ran for the stairwell. Her panicked breathing was incredibly loud in the quiet, echoing space. She climbed the concrete steps, but the building was warping around her. She reached the first landing. The faded sign read, Level 1. She climbed higher, her small legs burning. Level 2. She climbed another entire flight, desperate to reach her floor. But the next sign she saw read, Level 2 again. The entities were trying to trap her in the dark. Refusing to give up, she blindly climbed another flight and pushed open the heavy fire door. The hallway was identical to hers, but every single metal number plate in the doors had been scrambled into random, unrecognizable digits. Relying purely on memory, she slowly walked down the dim, flickering corridor, counting the identical doors in the silence. 1, 2, 3, 4. She reached out, her small hand trembling, and pushed the heavy door open. The apartment was dead silent, suffocated by the thick, pungent smell of burning incense. The furniture had been pushed aside. In the center of the dark living room, a solemn, quiet funeral was taking place, and the portrait resting on the wooden altar belonged to her mother. The girl woke up in her bed, her body soaked in a freezing sweat. She tried to convince herself it was just a nightmare, but the dead are notoriously patient. Months later, the father excitedly gathered the family to announce they were moving to a larger unit. The girl's blood ran completely cold when he proudly revealed their new address. They were moving to the 12th floor, apartment 1201. The exact same number her sister later confessed she had seen in her own parallel nightmares about ghosts chasing their family in the dark. The move marked the beginning of the end. An oppressive, negative energy settled permanently into the cold corners of apartment 1201. The parents' once happy marriage turned violently toxic. The heavy atmosphere bred constant anger. The father ultimately cheated, fracturing the family completely and leading to a devastating divorce. The girl eventually moved across the world to Australia, desperate to escape the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of that cursed home. But her mother stayed behind. Years later, the mother befriended a local shaman who came to visit the quiet, empty apartment. The moment the shaman stepped through the door, she froze. She stared into the dark corner of the living room, her eyes wide with an unsettling realization. In a trembling whisper, the shaman revealed that a young, pale man in his mid-20s was standing perfectly still in the shadows. The entity was obsessively infatuated with the mother. He had been standing guard in that corner for years, deliberately radiating a toxic, chaotic energy designed to violently destroy every single relationship she tried to build. The 10-year-old girl hadn't just had a nightmare. She had been granted a terrifying glimpse of the parasitic entity that had marked her family. And despite her desperate attempt to point him away, the dead had eventually found their way home. When an entity claims a family, they will patiently tear the walls down from the inside to have you all to themselves. But sometimes, the darkness doesn't need to break a family apart. It simply preys on those who are already living with strangers. Let us travel now to the United Kingdom, where a group of university students are about to learn that they share their narrow terrace house with an extra, unseen roommate. Moving into a shared house with friends is a rite of passage. But Victorian-era terrace houses in the UK have stood for over a century. Their narrow, claustrophobic corridors and damp, brick-lined basements have absorbed the residual energy of hundreds of transient lives. When a group of students moved into their new home, they expected the usual creaks of an old building. They did not expect the suffocating atmosphere waiting behind the front door. Walking into the house, a dark corridor stretched back toward a dim kitchen, with a shadowy living room tucked to the side. On their very first day, exploring the dusty corners of the property, they ventured down the steep, creaking stairs into the pitch-black basement. The air down there was freezing, thick with the smell of wet earth. Sweeping their flashlight across the shadows, they found something deeply unsettling on an old workbench. It was a meticulously crafted matchstick model. But it wasn't just any building. It was an exact, perfect, miniature replica of the very house they were standing in. Scattered around it were yellowed, decaying newspaper clippings from the 1970s. It was a silent, eerie monument, left behind by someone obsessively fixated on the property. They nervously laughed it off. But the house quickly made it known they were not alone. While sitting in the quiet kitchen, the students would constantly see tall, dark human silhouettes darting silently across the living room out of the corners of their eyes. In the dead of night, when the house was completely silent, the heavy thud of frantic footsteps would echo through the upstairs hallway. It sounded like a full-grown man sprinting back and forth across the floorboards. For months, the students politely texted each other, asking whoever was running around to please keep it down. But the terrifying realization eventually set in. Every time the heavy footsteps pounded through the dark, all of them were already locked safely in their beds. Downstairs, kitchen cabinets would swing themselves wide open in the dark, and a deafening, violent, metallic bang would suddenly strike the bedroom radiators, unprompted, jolting them out of a dead sleep. Unable to endure the crushing anxiety, the group packed their belongings at the end of the year and signed a lease for a different house, desperate to leave the shadows behind. But the darkness, it seemed, had already attached itself to them. The second house was supposed to be a fresh start. Instead, the atmosphere was instantly heavier. The upstairs hallway felt impossibly long and suffocatingly quiet. The heavy, phantom footsteps resumed almost immediately, pacing right outside their bedroom doors in the pitch black. One night, a roommate was sitting alone in the locked upstairs bathroom. The house was dead silent. Suddenly, the brass handle of the bathroom door began to violently rattle. Someone was aggressively twisting the knob back and forth, desperately trying to force the door open. And from the other side of the thin wood, she heard the unmistakable, high-pitched sound of someone softly giggling in the dark. She threw the door open. The hallway was completely empty, and everyone else was fast asleep. The climax of the terror happened in the bedroom. The narrator of our story was lying in bed, the room bathed in shadows. They were drifting into that vulnerable, heavy state just before deep sleep. The room was perfectly still. And then, a sudden freezing draft swept across their pillow. Right next to their ear, hovering just inches from their face, they heard a loud, incredibly distinct exhale. It was the heavy, raspy breath of a large man, exhaling so forcefully that the student actually felt the freezing air wash over their skin. Paralyzed by pure, instinctual terror, they slowly rolled over. Standing right beside the mattress, towering over the bed in the pitch black, was a solid, human-like figure. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring down in absolute silence, before slowly melting away into the shadows of the room. The student eventually moved out, leaving the house and its unseen occupants behind. But to this day, they cannot help but wonder about the new, unsuspecting students who have moved into those narrow rooms, completely unaware of the invisible roommates waiting for them in the dark. When an entity breathes into your ear, it shatters the illusion of safety, proving that pulling the blankets up will not protect you. But while some spirits terrorize the waking world, others prefer to wait until we are completely paralyzed by our own minds. Let us travel now to another quiet home, where the terrifying phenomenon of sleep paralysis is about to become an open door for something far more sinister. For 19 years, a family lived in a seemingly ordinary 40-year-old suburban house. On the outside, it was a perfectly peaceful home. But inside, the long carpeted hallways and quiet bedrooms were shared with things that simply did not belong to the living. There were two distinct residents who walked the halls in the dead of night. The first was a delicate, misty silhouette of a 5-year-old girl in an old-fashioned white dress. She was a quiet, innocent presence, only ever revealing herself to the women of the household. The second was far more imposing, a tall, unnaturally broad man wearing a dark top hat. He never spoke. He never moved toward anyone. He would simply stand in the thick shadows of the hallway, watching the family with a heavy, unblinking gaze. For nearly 2 decades, the family coexisted with these silent watchers. But the delicate balance of their home was eventually shattered, replaced by a suffocating wave of pure, concentrated malice. It began with the mother. Deep in the middle of the night, she was suddenly pulled from her sleep. Her eyes snapped open in the pitch black. She tried to sit up, but her body completely refused to obey. She was locked in the terrifying grip of sleep paralysis. But this was not just a trick of the mind. The air in the room grew unnaturally cold and dense. A sudden, crushing weight pressed down violently onto her chest and arms, pinning her flat against the mattress. She couldn't see anything hovering above her, but she could feel the undeniable, suffocating energy of a malevolent entity pressing its invisible weight into her bones. She desperately tried to scream, to force the words out of her paralyzed throat, but only a ragged, silent breath escaped. It took agonizing minutes of sheer willpower to finally break the paralysis, gasping for air in the quiet room. But the darkness was not finished. It simply moved down the hall to the brother's bedroom. His girlfriend was staying over, asleep on the side of the mattress closest to the empty room. Around 3 a.m., the heavy silence woke her. Just like the mother, she found herself completely frozen, her muscles locked in place. As her eyes adjusted to the dim, blue light filtering through the blinds, she realized she was not alone. Standing right beside the bed, staring directly over the edge of the mattress, was the little girl in the white dress. But the innocent, misty child had changed. Her small face was deeply distorted, twisted into a demented, horrifying expression of pure, unadulterated anger. She didn't reach out. She didn't make a sound. She just stood there in the dead silence, staring down at the paralyzed woman with a gaze full of venom and hatred. The girlfriend lay there, choking on her own silent panic, making soft, pathetic whimpering noises in her throat, until the spell finally broke, and the girl vanished into thin air. The very next night, the true nightmare claimed the narrator herself. She went to bed early, hoping to sleep through the heavy, anxious atmosphere that had taken over the house. But hours later, her eyes opened into the dark. Her limbs were entirely dead weight. She was completely paralyzed. Across the room, the door to her closet was slightly ajar. Normally, she could see the faint outlines of clothes hanging in the dark. But tonight, the space inside the closet was an impenetrable, unnatural wall of pure blackness. and radiating from that pitch-black void was a thick, malevolent energy. It felt like a physical pressure pushing against her face. She tried to look away. She desperately wanted to close her eyes, but her gaze was completely locked, forced to stare into the abyss of the closet as the terrifying presence slowly leaked into the room. And then, the focal point of the dread slowly shifted. The crushing energy moved from the closet to the very foot of her bed. She couldn't see it clearly, but she could feel the massive, towering shape of something standing right at the edge of her mattress. The air grew so heavy she could barely pull oxygen into her lungs. In her mind, she was violently shaking her head back and forth, screaming in pure terror. But in reality, her body lay perfectly still, trapped in silence as the towering entity loomed over her in the dark. She endured that silent, suffocating torture for what felt like hours, praying for the sun to rise, praying for her body to finally wake up. When she finally broke free, the physical pressure instantly vanished, but the psychological scar remained. The house had changed. The entities were no longer just watching from the shadows. They were waiting for the lights to go out, ready to trap them in their own bodies. When our own minds trap us in the dark, the entities in our homes have free rein to feed on our deepest fears. But sometimes, the tragedy of the past is so heavy that it spills out into the hallways, repeating itself night after night. Let us travel now to a massive apartment complex where the quiet hours of the early morning belong entirely to the dead. There is a unique kind of liminal isolation found in older apartment buildings. You are surrounded by hundreds of other sleeping people, separated only by a few inches of drywall and concrete, yet you are entirely alone. The long, windowless corridors stretch endlessly in both directions, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of fluorescent lights. The only sounds are the distant, muffled hum of refrigerators and the hollow echoing of the elevator shafts. Our 9th story takes us to a 50-year-old concrete complex. It was a place that felt perpetually tired, carrying a heavy, suffocating atmosphere that seemed to seep directly from the foundation. Years ago, during a crowded holiday gathering, a young man stepped away from the noise of the party. Crushed by a profound, agonizing depression, he quietly locked himself inside one of the bathrooms. The tragedy that followed left a permanent scar on the building. The profound despair he felt in his final moments did not simply fade away. It soaked into the very walls, leaving behind a lingering, restless sorrow that slowly began to manifest in the dark. Over the next decade, the building became a hollow shell of quiet terror. The night security guards, sitting alone in the dim glow of their monitors, would routinely report seeing a pale, translucent figure standing completely still in the empty parking lot, before slowly floating upward into the pitch-black sky. In the dead of night, residents would hear the chilling, disembodied sound of a slow, mournful whistle drifting through the concrete stairwells. Sometimes, a little girl in a white dress with long, dark hair could be seen sprinting silently down the endless hallways, turning a corner and vanishing completely into thin air. But the most relentless haunting targeted a single family, turning their nights into a grueling test of psychological endurance. It happened every single night for 2 agonizing months. The haunting operated on a strict, terrifying schedule. The family would go to sleep, leaving the apartment dead silent. But somewhere between exactly 3:10 and 3:43 a.m., the heavy atmosphere in the room would suddenly shift. The family's dog, usually a calm and quiet companion, would wake up. But he didn't bark. He didn't run. He would slowly back himself into the corner of the room, his entire body trembling violently. He would let out a low, continuous, vibrating growl from deep within his chest, his wide eyes locked in the dead stare, entirely focused on the heavy wooden front door. The narrator, exhausted from school and entirely sleep-deprived, would lie frozen in bed, watching the dog stare at the doorway. The silence in the apartment was deafening, and then they noticed the lights. The long concrete hallway outside their apartment was equipped with automatic motion-censored lights to save electricity. In the pitch black of their living room, the narrator and their father sat perfectly still, staring at the thin, dark gap at the bottom of their front door. Click. Far down at the end of the corridor, the first light flickered on. The faint yellow glow spilled under the door. Someone, or something, had just stepped off the stairs. They held their breath. There were no footsteps. There was no sound of shoes scuffing against the linoleum. The hallway was completely, impossibly silent. Click. The next light in the sequence buzzed to life. The unseen entity was walking down the hall, triggering the motion sensors one by one. The dog's low growl deepened, the hair on its back standing straight up. Click. Click. The glowing gap under the door grew brighter and brighter as the invisible presence slowly made its way down the corridor, passing the other empty apartments. It was a slow, deliberate march. The sheer anticipation of the approaching lights was a suffocating torture. And then, with a final, heavy buzz, the light directly outside their door snapped on. The entity had arrived. It was standing right on the other side of the wood. The dog practically pressed itself into the wall, whimpering in sheer terror at whatever was radiating through the heavy door. Gathering every ounce of courage he had, the father quietly stood up. He walked slowly to the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the brass deadbolt. He unlatched it and violently threw the door open, stepping out into the bright yellow hallway. It was completely, utterly empty. There was no one there. But the dog continued to stare, paralyzed by the invisible mass standing just inches away. Eventually, unable to take the psychological torment any longer, the narrator broke down, screaming into the empty hallway, begging the sorrowful entity to finally leave them in peace. And eventually, the lights stopped turning on. While some buildings carry the heavy sorrow of a single tragedy, others seem to be built on land that simply rejects the living entirely. Let us travel now to our final destination, a lonely, yellow house in the quiet town of Sandy Point, Maine, where a father is about to realize he is not the only one walking the halls. There is a profound, unsettling stillness that blankets the deep corners of New England. The town of Sandy Point was small, isolated, and completely suffocated by a strange, heavy atmosphere. It didn't matter if you walked down the street at high noon or in the dead of night, the roads were always completely empty. It was a town that felt entirely abandoned by time. On a hill, just past a sharp, winding turn, sat an incredibly old house. It was painted a pale, fading yellow, surrounded by a yard filled with overgrown, twisted apple trees. Their gnarled branches would cast long, skeletal shadows against the siding in the pale moonlight. Inside, the house smelled of dry rot and ancient timber. The floors were original, uneven wood that groaned under the slightest weight, and tucked away in the kitchen was a heavy wooden door that led down to a pitch-black dirt floor basement. From the very first night, the young woman living there knew the house was occupied by something unseen. The heavy feeling of being watched was constant. But the entity didn't just watch. It liked to interact with the physical world in the quiet hours of the night. Every evening, she would carefully lay out her clothes for the next day on a wooden chair in her bedroom. She would turn off the lamp, pull the blankets up to her chin, and let the heavy silence of the house lull her to sleep. But when she woke up in the cold morning air, the chair would be completely empty, Her clothes hadn't fallen to the floor. They had been deliberately taken by unseen hands and scattered across the entire house. A shirt draped over a railing down the hall. A pair of jeans folded neatly on a dining room chair. It was a quiet, mocking reminder that while she slept, something else was freely roaming the dark corridors of her home. Then came the footsteps. Deep in the middle of the night, when the house was perfectly still, the auditory torment would begin. Creak, creak. It was the distinct, heavy sound of someone slowly climbing the wooden stairs. The footsteps would reach the second-floor landing and begin to pace. They would slowly walk past her closed bedroom door, the floorboards groaning under a massive, invisible weight. They would drift down the hall toward her parents' room, pause in the suffocating silence, and then slowly pace back. She would lie perfectly still in the dark, listening to the rhythmic pacing. Sometimes, feeling braver than she would softly call out into the darkness. "Hello?" The footsteps would instantly stop. The hallway would fall completely dead silent. Nothing would answer. She would lie awake for hours, waiting for the heavy tread to resume. But the entity always waited until she finally drifted back to sleep. Her mother was terrified of the property, but her father was a staunch, unwavering skeptic. He believed in wind drafts, settling wood, and logical explanations. He did not believe in ghosts. Until one quiet afternoon, the house finally broke his logic. He had stayed home from work, fighting off a severe illness. The house was completely empty, bathed in the pale gray light of a Maine afternoon. He was lying in bed, drifting in and out of a feverish sleep, when a sudden sound pulled him awake. It was the heavy front door opening. Then, the undeniable sound of heavy work boots walking into the dining room. Assuming his wife had simply come home early from work to check on him, he called out her name. The house remained dead silent. He called out again, louder this time. Still, there was no reply. But the heavy footsteps continued, slowly moving across the antique wooden floorboards. Alarmed, the father threw off the blankets. He was a practical man who didn't take chances with intruders. He reached under his bed, pulled out his loaded firearm, and quietly crept to the top of the wooden stairs. He looked down into the dim hallway below. Walking slowly toward the living room was a tall, broad-shouldered man. He was wearing heavy, dirt-stained overalls and thick leather work boots. The father could only see the man's back as he calmly stepped through the doorway and into the living room. Raising his weapon, the father descended the stairs, his voice echoing through the quiet house as he loudly warned the intruder to leave immediately or be shot. He stepped into the living room, his finger resting on the trigger, fully prepared to confront a dangerous man. The living room was completely empty. There was nowhere to hide. The windows were locked from the inside. The doors were sealed shut. The father systematically swept every single room, checking the closets, the pitch-black dirt basement, and the perimeter outside. There was absolutely no one there. The man in the overalls had simply vanished into the thin, cold air. They moved away to the city of Bangor shortly after, leaving the quiet yellow house and its unseen occupants behind in the twisted apple orchard. The heavy doors of our haunted houses have finally clicked shut for the night. The long carpeted hallways are empty, and the suffocating silence has returned to the dark corners of the rooms. If these stories from Mystery Archives have safely guided you through the shadows tonight, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notifications so we can meet again when the lights go out. But for now, the darkness belongs entirely to you. Your doors are firmly locked. The room is safe and empty, and and there is absolutely nothing left to fear. Close your eyes, breathe in the quiet, and sleep well.